Hi, this is Morgan with the Cozby Library, and today I will be walking you through how to do the It's Fall Y'all cross stitch pattern. So if you picked up your kit from the library, this is the bag of supplies you received, and it has almost everything you need to do the cross stitch. First, you have your cross stitch pattern, and then you have your cross stitch fabric. So this is 14 count white Aida fabric. And it's a pretty sturdy fabric, so you don't really need an embroidery hoop to do this cross stitch pattern effectively. It's small enough and the fabric is sturdy enough that you can just stitch the fabric like it is. And in your fabric, in one of the corners, you'll see a needle. You're welcome to use the needle we provided, or if you have a preferred needle at home, you can use that one. I know I have a very particular needle that I use for all my hand stitching projects, and so I always use my trusty needle. So if you have one of those, feel free to use it instead of the one we provided. And then you have your colors of embroidery floss. So this pattern only uses 4 colors of embroidery floss. You have your reddish color, your golden color, and then you have white and black. The white and black you don't need much of, so we were able to fit those on the same bobbin. So you should have those 4 different colors on 3 different bobbins. And for other supplies you will need a pair of scissors to cut the floss. So this is the kind of scissors I'll be using. They are, hand sewing scissors, but you could use any pair of scissors that you have access to. So this is our It's Fall Y'all cross stitch pattern. And as you can see with the cross stitch pattern, it is laid out on a grid, and each square of the grid represents one cross stitch. So for the 2 leaves, each of these filled in squares is a single cross stitch or X stitch. For the white floss, there's only a total of 4 stitches. So here, 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 here. So just the 4 eyes have white stitches. So the rest of this white space is just blank. So no stitching there. And then the text up here, It's Fall Y'all, that is a back stitch. And so it's a little different than a cross stitch. And this is just our basic pattern, and think of the pattern as the instructions to create the final product. And it's pretty easy to read once you get the hang of it. And we'll get started on translating this pattern into stitches on the fabric. As we get started with stitching our pattern, you don't have to worry too much about figuring out the exact center of the fabric because the design is a bit smaller than the fabric that you were given, but it is good to make sure you start stitching to where the 7-inch side is the top and bottom, and the 5-inch sides are the sides, because it's more of a horizontal pattern. So you'll want to make sure that you stitch the right way, but you don't have to worry too much about finding the center because the fabric is larger than you need. So at the top of the pattern, there is a single stitch, then 2 more stitches, and then 3 more stitches, and that's what we're going to start with when we're stitching. And so let's get started. So with the maroon floss, I'm going to unravel some of it, and this sewing method I use is this floss comes with 6 strands of floss. I'm going to separate out just 1 single strand, so just 1. So what I do is I pull one of those strands, and then I'm going to lift the threads of the bobbin is off the table, and then gravity just kind of unwinds the thread for you, which means fewer messy tangles and knots that you have to try to undo. So this pattern does require 2 strands of floss at a time. So when I do my 1 strand of floss, I take the 2 ends and put them together, and then I thread those 2 ends through my needle. And some folks use a needle threader. I don't, but if you have one and you prefer to use that, feel free. Okay, so I have that threaded and ready to go, and you can see there's a little loop on the end of it. That loop means I won't have to tie a knot on the back of my fabric. And so this stitch that I'm going to start with is a little bit off center on like the left hand side, and we want to leave space to do our text here. So I'm going to start it right about here. I think that'll work. And so with a cross stitch, I start in the bottom left hand corner, and then I go over 1 to the right and then up 1. So that creates a diagonal line. And then when I come through to the back, I'm going to pull, and I'm going to pull slowly, and you see that little loop? I'll thread my needle through the loop, and then I'm going to put my needle through the hole directly underneath where I just came through. And then pull through, and then I will go over 1 to the left and up 1, creating another diagonal line, and it creates a little stitch that looks like an X. So the next row of stitches on our pattern, you can see that it's 2 stitches in a row, and it starts 1 further over from that one, so I'll just move my needle down and over. And the cool thing about when you're stitching in a line is you can do the 2 starting diagonal lines. So I did my 1 line here, and then I'm going to go to the back, and I'm going to go down, and instead of coming back and finishing that stitch, I'll make another starting stitch here. So I have the 2 starting diagonal lines, and then I'll have the 2 here, and then the next line of stitches, I can see that there's going to be 3 stitches under those 2, and I'm just going to kind of stitch through these until I get to the end of this floss, so I can show you how to secure the floss when you're done with a piece of it. And so that row of 3, that row has 1 stitch, a gap of 3, and then the 3 that I just stitched. So I'm actually going to count over 1, 2, 3. I'm going to count a 4th one over because that 4th space is the one I actually want to stitch. And now I'm in the right spot to start that next line of stitches that is a total of 8 stitches long. And when you're stitching, it's a little easier to stitch top to bottom, but you know, it's kind of a personal preference, and you can work out a method that, you know, works for you. The cool thing about cross stitching is that there's a lot of correct ways to get to the end result. So I'm going to keep stitching, and I'm kind of running low on floss. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is show you how to close the floss. So with closing the floss, you can tie like a double knot, but it's a little difficult. So what I like to do is, when I'm finished with a piece of floss, is I go and take my needle and I will run it through a piece of thread that's already like securely on. So I'll just run it underneath there. I'll pull it through, and then I'll do the same thing again, and it kind of knots it around a place that's already secure and allows you to cut it, and it lets you kind of keep that back area of the cross stitch a little tidier, a little less mess to work around, and so I find that very helpful. So that's the starting point of this, and hopefully if you're not familiar with cross stitch, you now know how to get started. Alright, so now I'm going to show you how to get started on the back stitch. We're going to start with the F in fall, and as you can see where the back stitching is, it's not a stitch that is fully filled in, it's not a full square, so that means you're not doing a cross stitch, you're doing a back stitch. So you're just going from one point to another point. And we're going to start with the F because it's the letter that is closest to this tip of this maroon leaf. So it'll be easy to make sure we get it in the right place. And so with a back stitch, we're going to use the same method we used to start out. So I'm going to take my black floss and I'm going to unravel it a little bit. I'm going to hook the floss back into that little cardboard separator, and then I'm going to separate a single strand of floss. And as I do that, I'll let gravity kind of do the work for me in untangling it. I will cut the floss, and then I'm going to take the single piece of floss, put both ends together, and I will thread those ends through the needle. All right, so with this you can see on the pattern, from the tip of the leaf we go up 2 and over 1 to start our F. So if I take my cross stitch here and I turn it over, at my very top I'm going to go 1, 2, and then over, and that should be the bottom part of my F. And it looks like I got it right. So here, the bottom part of the F is just a diagonal. So it's over 1, up 1, and then we're going to come back around here, and I'll do the same thing I did earlier, which is I put my needle through the thread to tighten it, and instead of knotting it. And then the next one, I go up. It's a straight line of 4 boxes. So, I mean, there's a variety of ways you can do this. You can stitch each individual one, or you could do 2 and 2. I'll probably, or 3 and 1. I'll probably do 2 and 2. So from where I am now, I'll go 1, 2, and I'll come through here. And the reason why it's a back stitch is because I went to the point where I wanted to be, you know, next. And now I'm going to stitch back to that point to make that line. And now from the back, I'll go up another 2. Oh, and it looks looks like I unthreaded my needle, which is fine. It happens sometimes. You just have to rethread it. And if your thread ever gets a little frayed on the ends, you can always cut a little bit off and then try to thread it again. That's super helpful if you're having kind of like a finicky thread. And it's important to remember that the more times your needle becomes unthreaded, the more practice you get at threading a needle. And sometimes, you know, it's super easy and other times it's pretty hard, as is most things in life. Okay, so we're back, needle threaded. We're gonna come back. There we are. And so then we have this little, I guess, arm of the F. So we can stitch that. And then, yeah, so back stitching is actually sometimes a little bit, you know, in my opinion, easier than cross stitching because you're really just making the lines that are on the page. It's a little less counting because you can usually eyeball if you're getting it right. Whereas, you know, with cross stitching, you know, sometimes you lose count and you make some creative changes to the pattern. But there is our back stitched F. And so sometimes with a cross stitch, it is really hard to tell from the pattern on the page how cute the finished product is going to be. So as a motivation for y'all, this is the finished product. So it's very cute, it's very petite, in something that you know, you could do like a construction paper frame around it and make it into like a holiday card. You could get a small frame and hang it on your wall. It's really cute, happy, and you know, even though it's a bunch of squares put together, it is this beautifully dynamic piece of artwork that you will make that is full of personality and joy. And so this is the finished cross stitch. It's fall, y'all.